I picture stone, worn smooth by countless hands, passed from one set of fingers to another across generations that stretched longer than any of us now can easily imagine. The stone is cool, dense, flecked with minerals that catch whatever light falls upon it, and it rests in a palm that knows its weight, its balance, the way it settles into the curve of a human hand as though the two were made for each other. This is the Paleolithic, a word that means old stone, ancient stone, and it encompasses a span of time so vast that our modern minds struggle to hold it. More than 2.5 million years, from the first crude tools shaped by early human ancestors to the ending of the last ice age, when glaciers finally retreated and the world began to warm into something we might recognize. I find myself thinking about duration, about the incomprehensible length of human experience contained within that single era. If we were to walk backward through time at the rate of 1 year per step, we would need to walk thousands upon thousands of miles before reaching even the tail end of the Paleolithic, and millions more to find its beginning. But numbers dissolve into something almost meaningless at that scale. So instead I think about the stone and the hand and the way a life was lived in the presence of ice and mammoth, of cave and fire, of star-filled skies that held the same constellations we see now, though the people looking up had no names for them that we would recognize. The air feels different when I imagine it, crisper perhaps, carrying scents we have lost, the particular musk of megafauna, the green sharpness of plants that no longer exist, the mineral taste of rivers running with glacial melt. I see small groups of people, 20 or 30 perhaps, moving through a landscape that shifts with the seasons, following patterns established over lifetimes, over hundreds of lifetimes, their knowledge carried not in writing but in memory, in demonstration, in the careful watching of children as their parents shape stone, prepare hide, read the signs of weather in cloud formations and wind direction. There is no rush in this world, no arbitrary divisions of hours and minutes. Time moves with the sun's arc across the sky, with the moon's phases, with the migrations of animals and the ripening of wild foods, and human activity flows within those rhythms, like water finding its course. The stone tools themselves tell stories, each one the end point of a process that began with the careful selection of the right material. Flint, perhaps, obsidian, chert, something that would fracture in predictable ways when struck with precision. And the making of a tool was not quick, not careless, but deliberate, almost meditative. The napper sitting with stone in hand, feeling for the grain, the hidden planes along which it might split, a single strike, sharp and controlled, and a flake falls away, then another, and slowly, gradually, the rough stone reveals a cutting edge, a scraping surface, a point for piercing, each tool shaped for a specific purpose, for cutting meat, for scraping hides, for digging roots, for carving wood or bone. These were not simple people living simple lives. That idea dissolves when you hold one of their tools. When you see the sophistication of their understanding, they knew materials with an intimacy we have lost, could read stone the way we read text, could see in an unworked piece of flint the knife or scraper hidden within it, waiting to be revealed. And beyond the tools, beyond the practical necessities of survival, there was something else, something that speaks to us across all those millennia with strange clarity. They made beauty. They created art. On cave walls, deep underground, they painted animals with such skill and observation that we still marvel. Bison and horses and aurochs rendered in ochre and charcoal, their bodies twisted in motion, their forms so vivid they seem almost to breathe. I imagine standing in one of those caves, far from the entrance, where daylight never reaches, holding a torch that flickers and casts moving shadows, and on the walls around me, animals appear and disappear as the flame dances, as though they are moving, running, alive in some liminal space between rock and firelight. Who were these painters? What did they think as they worked? Did they see this as sacred, as practical, as both, or as something we have no category for, no way to comprehend? The questions linger, unanswerable, beautiful in their mystery, and I find myself drawn not to definitive explanations, but to the wonder of it, the simple fact that people living tens of thousands of years ago, people who had never seen metal, who had never planted a crop or built a permanent structure, nevertheless felt compelled to create, to leave marks that would outlast them, that would speak to us now, across a gulf of time that should render us utterly alien to each other, and yet somehow does not. The deep past of the Paleolithic begins in Africa, in a landscape that was both familiar and utterly foreign to what we know now. Grasslands stretched beneath skies that had never seen smoke from factories, never heard the sound of engines. Rivers flowed through valleys where no bridge had ever stood. And in this world, the first members of the genus Homo were learning what it meant to be human. More than 2 million years ago, perhaps 2.5 million, though the dating grows uncertain at such distances, early human ancestors began to do something remarkable. They began to modify stone deliberately, not accidentally, not randomly, but with intent, with a goal in mind. They struck one rock against another and created something new, something that had not existed before, the first technology, the first manufactured objects in the human story. These earliest tools were simple, crude, even by later standards, but they represented a threshold crossed, a line between using what nature provided and actively reshaping the world. The tools are called Oldowan, named for Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, where they were first recognized, and they consist mostly of a sharp flake struck from larger stones, and the cores from which those flakes were removed, basic, functional, effective. Imagine the cognitive leap required, the moment when an early human looked at a stone and saw not just a stone but a possibility, saw that if struck in a particular way it would yield a sharp edge, saw that this edge could cut through hide that fingers alone could not tear, could scrape meat from bone more efficiently than teeth, could open access to foods previously unavailable. This was not instinct. Animals use tools. Otters crack shells with rocks. Crows drop nuts onto roads to break them. But this was different. This required planning, foresight, the ability to hold in mind an object that did not yet exist, and then bring it into being through a sequence of deliberate actions. And once begun, the tradition continued, parent to child, generation to generation. The knowledge of stoneworking passed along through demonstration and practice. A young one watching an elder, seeing the angle of the strike, the force required, the way to read the stone's surface for the best point of impact. Time moved slowly in those early millennia. Change occurred across spans we can barely conceive. Tens of thousands of years might pass with tool technology remaining essentially stable, the same forms repeated, the same techniques employed, because they worked, because they were sufficient for the lives being lived, and there was no imperative for constant innovation, no competition driving rapid change. The people making these tools were not quite like us. Homo habilis, handyman, with brains larger than earlier hominins, but still smaller than ours, or Homo erectus, upright man, who would eventually spread out of Africa and into Asia, carrying stone tool technology across continental distances, walking slowly, generation by generation, following food sources and favorable climates, and as they moved, as populations spread and time accumulated, the tools evolved, became more sophisticated, more refined. Somewhere around 1.5 million years ago, a new technology emerged, the Aculean, named for Saint Achille in France, and it brought with it a new form, the hand axe. These hand axes were larger than Oldowan tools, more carefully shaped, worked on both sides to create a symmetrical form, teardrop-shaped or oval, with a pointed end and a broader base that fit comfortably in the palm. They required more skill to make, more planning, more strikes in careful sequence to achieve the desired shape. What strikes me about these tools is their consistency, their almost standardized form, across vast distances and long periods of time. Hand axes found in Africa look remarkably similar to those found in Europe or Western Asia, as though there was some shared template, some ideal form held in the minds of makers separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Were they teaching each other across those distances? Unlikely. The movement of populations was too slow, the contact too infrequent. Instead, it suggests something else, that given similar materials and similar needs, the human mind tends towards similar solutions, finds the same efficient forms, recognizes the same effective proportions. A well-made hand axe is beautiful, even now, even to eyes accustomed to precision manufacturing. There is something deeply satisfying about the symmetry, the balance, the way it fits the hand. And some archaeologists have wondered whether these tools were purely functional or whether they served some other purpose as well, as displays of skill perhaps, as indicators of the maker's abilities, as objects that carried meaning beyond their immediate utility. The people of the Aculean were living lives that revolved around movement, following animal migrations, tracking seasonal abundances of plant foods. They were hunter-gatherers in the truest sense, though we must be careful with the term hunter, because the archaeology suggests that much of their meat came from scavenging, from finding the kills of large predators and using stone tools to access parts of the carcass that other scavengers could not, breaking bones to reach the rich marrow inside, cutting away meat before the lions or hyenas returned. Fire appears in this story, though exactly when remains debated. Evidence of controlled fire use extends back perhaps 1 million years, maybe more, and it would have changed everything, provided warmth on cold nights, offered protection from predators who feared the flames, and most importantly, transformed food, made it more digestible, safer, allowed access to nutrients that raw food could not provide. I think about the first fire, not the first wildfire sparked by lightning, but the first fire deliberately maintained by human hands, the careful feeding of fuel, the guarding of embers, the knowledge that this precious thing must not be allowed to die, because making fire from scratch was still perhaps beyond their abilities, so a fire once obtained, whether from a natural source or another group, had to be kept alive, carried from camp to camp, protected like the treasure it was. Hearths begin to appear in the archaeological record, circular arrangements of stones, layers of ash, charred bones, the evidence of repeated use, of people gathering around flames as darkness fell, and in that gathering, in that circle of light pushing back the night, something social was happening, stories perhaps, or proto-stories, communication that went beyond the immediate and practical, the sharing of experience, of knowledge, of something we might almost call culture. The Paleolithic was not uniform, not a single unchanging block of time. It shifted and evolved as climates changed, as ice ages came and went during glacial periods. Ice sheets covered much of northern Europe and Asia. Sea levels dropped as water became locked in glaciers, and land bridges appeared connecting previously separated regions, allowing humans and animals to cross into new territories. Between glacial periods, the world warmed, ice retreated, forests spread, coastlines shifted as seas rose, and the people of the Paleolithic adapted, moved with the changes, altered their strategies and technologies to fit new circumstances. They were not passive victims of climate, but active responders, flexible, innovative within their own context. By 500,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, new species had emerged, Homo heidelbergensis, named for a jaw found near Heidelberg in Germany. And these people made tools that showed increasing sophistication, used fire regularly, hunted large game with wooden spears. The earliest complete hunting spears we have found date to around 300,000 years ago, from a site called Schöningen in Germany, carved from spruce, balanced for throwing, preserved in ancient peat. These spears tell us about planning, about coordinated group hunting, about the ability to bring down animals much larger and more powerful than any individual human. Horses, deer, perhaps even elephants. It required cooperation, strategy, an understanding of animal behavior, the patience to wait for the right moment, the courage to close with dangerous prey. And alongside the practical, the technological, something else was emerging, evidence of care, of attention to the dead. At Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones in Spain, hundreds of thousands of years old. The remains of at least 28 individuals were found deep in a cave system, deliberately placed there, it seems, accompanied by a single beautiful hand axe made of red quartzite, unlike the other tools found at the site, suggesting perhaps it was placed there intentionally as some form of grave good, some acknowledgement that death meant something, that the dead deserved consideration. I find myself paused by this, by the weight of it, because it suggests that even these early people, so different from us in many ways, nevertheless felt something we recognize, grief perhaps, or reverence, a sense that a person who had died was not simply gone, but required some ritual, some marking of their passing. Time continued its slow accumulation. Generations lived and died. Knowledge deepened. Technologies refined. And around 300,000 years ago, our own species appeared, Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, emerging in Africa with slightly larger brains, more gracile skeletons, distinctive skull shapes, but initially not particularly different in behavior from other human species already present for a long time, for more than 100,000 years. Homo sapiens made tools similar to those made by Neanderthals, by Denisovans, by other archaic humans. There was no sudden revolution, no immediate superiority, just another population among several, living, adapting, surviving, but somewhere, sometime, perhaps around 70,000 years ago, or perhaps earlier, something shifted. The archaeological record shows an increase in innovation, in symbolic behavior, in the production of art and ornament. Shell beads appear. Ochre shows evidence of processing for pigment. Long-distance trade networks begin to form, with materials like obsidian appearing hundreds of miles from their source. This is sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Though that term carries assumptions that may not be warranted, it was not necessarily sudden, not uniform across all populations. But something was changing. Human culture was elaborating, becoming more complex, more varied, more recognizably modern in its expressions. And yet, even with all this change, with all this growing complexity, the fundamental patterns of life remained. People still moved with the seasons, still followed game, still gathered plant foods, still shaped stone into tools, still sat around fires as night fell and the stars emerged overhead, living lives that to them were not primitive or simple, but full, complete, the only lives they knew or could imagine. The daily rhythm of Paleolithic life moved with a slowness that our modern minds find difficult to inhabit. There was no separation between work and life, between productive time and leisure, between the sacred and the mundane. Everything flowed together in a continuous stream of activity, dictated by necessity, by opportunity, by the endless cycle of seasons. Morning arrived with gradual light, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to pale gray, and people stirred from sleep in whatever shelter they had constructed. Caves, when available, though caves were not as common as we sometimes imagine. More often it was temporary structures, frameworks of branches covered with hides, simple windbreaks of piled stone, whatever provided protection from wind and rain and the cold that came with nightfall. The fire from the previous evening might still hold embers, carefully banked before sleep, covered with ash to preserve the coals through the dark hours, and the first task of morning was often to coax those embers back to flame, adding dry grass, small twigs, blowing gently to encourage the oxygen flow, watching as smoke rose, and then, finally, a small flame caught and grew. Food was the constant preoccupation, not in the anxious way we sometimes experience hunger now, but as the organizing principle of existence, where to find it, how to obtain it, how to process it, how to share it. These questions shaped every day, every decision, every movement across the landscape. For much of the Paleolithic, for the vast majority of that immense span of time, people lived in small mobile groups, probably between 20 and 50 individuals, though the exact numbers would have fluctuated with seasons and circumstances. These groups were not isolated. They encountered other groups, traded with them, exchanged members through marriage or adoption, maintained social networks that extended across considerable distances. The women, and here I must acknowledge that we are generalizing from limited evidence, from ethnographic parallels with recent hunter-gatherer societies, From the patterns we can discern in bones and tools, the women likely spent much of their time gathering plant foods, roots and tubers dug from the earth with weighted digging sticks, nuts collected and carried in leather bags or woven containers, berries picked when ripe, seeds gathered and perhaps ground into crude flour using stone mortars and pestles. This gathering was not simple or unskilled. It required encyclopedic knowledge of plants, which were edible and which poisonous, which parts could be eaten and which must be avoided. When each plant was at its peak, how to process foods that were toxic raw but nutritious when properly prepared. This knowledge was vast, complex, essential for survival, and it was learned over years of observation and instruction. The men, and again, we must hold these categories lightly, likely spent more time hunting, though women hunted too in many societies, and men gathered. The divisions were not rigid, but there were patterns, tendencies, and hunting in the Paleolithic required patience that bordered on meditation, tracking animals across long distances, reading signs invisible to untrained eyes, a bent blade of grass, a partial print in soft earth, the direction of travel inferred from the spacing of marks, the age of the trail estimated from how the edges of tracks had weathered. Sometimes hunting meant waiting, concealed near a water source or along a known game trail, staying motionless for hours, breathing slowly, becoming part of the landscape, until the moment came, the deer or horse within range, and then the explosion of motion, the spear thrown or thrust, the animal fleeing or falling, the chase if it ran wounded, the careful approach if it dropped, the quick end if it still lived. But hunting was uncertain, dangerous, often unsuccessful, and the gathered foods, the roots and nuts and seeds, these provided the stable foundation of the diet, the reliable calories that kept people alive when hunting failed, as it often did, for days or weeks at a time. When a large animal was killed, it became the center of intense activity. Butchering had to happen quickly before scavengers arrived. Before the meat began to spoil, stone tools came out, the carefully maintained knives and scrapers, and the animal was systematically dismantled, hide removed in large sections, meat cut from bones, organs extracted and distributed, nothing wasted, everything used. The liver might be eaten immediately, raw and warm, rich with nutrients, the tongue, the brain, delicacies that would not keep, shared among those present, according to complex rules of distribution that varied from group to group but always existed, always governed who received what, who got the choicest portions, who was obligated to share with whom. Bones were cracked open for marrow, the rich fatty substance inside scooped out and consumed, providing calories and nutrients impossible to obtain otherwise. Tendons were carefully removed and set aside. They would be dried and used as cordage, as thread for sewing hides, as backing for composite tools. The hide itself was precious. It required days of work to transform from raw skin to usable leather. First, it had to be cleaned, scraped free of fat and tissue, using specialized stone scrapers, held taut by several people or pegged to the ground, the scraper drawn across the surface again and again, removing every trace of meat, every bit of membrane. Then it might be treated with brain matter, the animal's own brain, mixed with water to create a paste, worked into the hide, the enzymes and oils in the brain, breaking down the proteins, beginning the transformation from stiff skin to supple leather, this knowledge that brains could tan hides seems almost magical, and yet it was known, understood, practiced across continents and millennia. The hide would be worked, stretched, softened through repeated manipulation, sometimes smoked over a fire to give it water resistance, to preserve it, to add durability, and finally it became clothing, blankets, shelter material, bags, cordage, the product of days or weeks of labor, irreplaceable, maintained and repaired until it finally wore through and could serve no more. Clothing in colder climates was sophisticated, carefully tailored, sewn with bone needles using sinew thread. Evidence from later in the Paleolithic shows fitted garments with sleeves, with hoods, designed to trap body heat and shed moisture, decorated with beads or carved bone, practical and beautiful, serving both physical and social needs. Tools required constant maintenance and replacement. Stone dulls with use, edges chip and break, and so there was always knapping to be done, sitting in good light, stone and hammerstone in hand, the rhythmic sound of percussion ringing across the camp, flakes flying, piling up around the napper's feet, each tool made fresh or old tools resharpened. The waste flakes themselves sometimes used for quick cutting tasks before being discarded. Different stones were preferred for different purposes. Flint was prized where available, obsidian even more so. Volcanic glass that could be worked to edges sharper than modern surgical steel. But these materials were not everywhere, and so people used what they could find. Chert, quartzite, whatever stone would fracture predictably and hold an edge, and they learned the properties of each, the way it felt, the sound it made when struck, the angle required to remove flakes cleanly. Sometimes they traveled long distances to obtain good stone, or traded with other groups who had access to it. Materials moved across landscapes through networks of exchange. Obsidian from a single volcanic source might end up hundreds of miles away, passing from group to group, each exchange strengthening social bonds, creating obligations, maintaining relationships that might prove crucial in times of scarcity. Wood was worked too, though it rarely survives in the archaeological record. Spears were carefully shaped, hafts created for stone tools, digging sticks weighted with pierced stones, containers carved from burls, all of it biodegradable, all of it vanished, leaving only rare glimpses in waterlogged sites where organic materials were preserved by lack of oxygen. Fire was tended constantly, never allowed to die if it could be helped. Later in the Paleolithic, people could create fire, striking flint against iron pyrite to create sparks, or using friction. A wooden drill spun rapidly against a wooden base until the friction generated enough heat to ignite tinder. But both methods required skill, patience, the right materials, and it was always easier to maintain existing fire than to make it anew. Around the fire in the evening, after the day's work, there was time for other things, for social grooming, for the telling of stories, though we cannot know what those stories contained, for the making of art, carved figures of animals or voluptuous human forms, the famous Venus figurines, their meaning debated but their presence undeniable, found across Europe and beyond, carved from ivory or bone or stone, small enough to carry, created with care and skill. Music, too. Bone flutes have been found, carefully drilled with finger holes, capable of producing multiple notes. able to carry melody, and we must imagine the sound in the darkness, simple tunes perhaps, or complex ones, we cannot know. But the presence of music seems certain, the human voice raised in song, hands clapping rhythm, feet stamping, the universal expressions of culture, finding form even in the deep past. Children were present in all of this, learning through observation and participation, a child watching a parent knap stone, trying it themselves with small pieces, learning through failure and guidance, a child following adults on gathering expeditions, learning to identify plants, to know what was safe, to understand the landscape. Childhood in the Paleolithic was likely both freer and more dangerous than our modern version. Free in that children were not separated from adult activities, not excluded or protected from the realities of survival, but dangerous because injury and illness that we can easily treat were often fatal, and predators were real threats, not hypothetical dangers. The landscape itself was different, populated with megafauna we can barely imagine, mammoths moving in herds across the tundra, woolly rhinoceros, cave bears massive beyond modern bears, cave lions, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet, saber-toothed cats in some regions and times. The Paleolithic world was crowded with large animals, and humans were not yet the dominant species. Just one among many, clever and adaptable, but not yet in control. Seasons governed everything. In the far north where Ice Age glaciers advanced and retreated, summers were brief but intensely productive. Plants grew rapidly. Animals migrated north to feed on the abundance, and humans followed, taking advantage of the seasonal plenty, hunting, gathering, preparing for the winter that would inevitably come. Winter was survival. Stores of dried meat, smoked fish, nuts gathered during autumn and cached in cool, dry places. And still there was hunger, times when food ran low, when hunting failed, when the stored foods proved insufficient, and people grew thin, relied on their fat reserves, on their knowledge of marginal foods, on anything that could provide calories. In warmer regions, the seasonal variation was less extreme but still present. Rainy seasons and dry seasons, times of abundance and times of scarcity, migrations following the patterns. Coastal populations might exploit sea resources, shellfish gathered from tidal zones, fish caught in weirs or with hooks carved from bone, seals hunted on beaches. Different strategies, different knowledge, but the same fundamental pattern of life, mobile, responsive, deeply embedded in the cycles of the natural world. Around 40,000 years ago, give or take a few millennia, something remarkable began to happen in Europe. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, who had been present in Africa and parts of Asia for much longer, began to arrive in significant numbers, moving westward, encountering populations that had been there for hundreds of thousands of years. The Neanderthals, who were not the brutish creatures of early imagination, but sophisticated people with their own technologies, their own cultures, their own ways of being human. For a time, these populations coexisted, perhaps 10,000 years or more, occupying the same landscapes, using similar resources, and the genetic evidence tells us they did more than simply coexist. They interbred, exchanged genes, so that most modern humans outside of Africa carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA, evidence written in our very cells of meetings, of relationships, of children born from unions between populations we now classify as separate species, but who were perhaps not quite so separate after all. The meeting of these peoples, what did it look like? Was it peaceful, hostile, indifferent? Probably all of these at different times and places. Exchanges of technology occurred. Neanderthals began using some tools more typical of modern humans. Modern humans may have learned cold weather survival strategies from Neanderthals who had been adapting to European climates for millennia. Knowledge flowed both ways, techniques shared, innovations spreading through contact and observation. But eventually, by around 40,000 years ago in some areas, 30,000 in others, the Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record. Their populations dwindled. Their distinctive tools ceased to be made. Their genes persisted only as small fractions in the genomes of other humans, and the reasons remain debated. Climate change, competition for resources, absorption through interbreeding, disease, probably no single cause but a combination, a gradual fading rather than a sudden catastrophe. And with their departure, Homo sapiens became the only human species, the sole survivors of a genus that had once been diverse, that had included many forms, many experiments in how to be human, all gone now except us, carrying forward alone into the future. This later period of the Paleolithic, sometimes called the Upper Paleolithic in Europe, was marked by an explosion of cultural innovation. Cave art reached its peak, the famous painted caves of France and Spain, Lascaux, Chauvet, Altamira, deep underground chambers where artists created images of breathtaking beauty and skill, horses galloping, bison charging, hands stenciled in negative space by blowing pigment around them, leaving the ghostly outlines pressed against stone. The artists who made these paintings understood perspective, shading, how to use the natural contours of the cave walls to give their animals dimension, movement. They mixed pigments from minerals, ochres for reds and yellows, manganese for blacks, charcoal for deep darks, ground them to powder, mixed them with animal fat or water, applied them with fingers with primitive brushes made from animal hair, with hollow bones used as spray tubes, working by flickering torchlight in chambers sometimes requiring difficult crawls through narrow passages to reach. They created galleries that still astonish us, still move us, the same images viewed tens of thousands of years apart, carrying meaning across an abyss of time we can measure but not truly bridge. Why they made these paintings remains mysterious. Were they shamanic, religious, educational, aesthetic, territorial markers, or something else entirely? Something we have no framework to understand. The paintings themselves cannot tell us. They simply exist, beautiful and mute, inviting interpretation but resisting certainty. Portable art became more common too. Carved figurines, decorated tools, bone carved with elaborate geometric patterns or images of animals, ivory beads strung into necklaces, shells pierced for suspension, brought from coastal areas far inland, traded over long distances, valued for their beauty, their rarity, their symbolic weight. Musical instruments became more sophisticated, flutes carved from bird bones, mammoth ivory, producing clear notes, capable of melody, and we must imagine the sound carried on the wind, echoing in caves, accompanying ceremonies we cannot reconstruct, marking moments of significance, celebration, mourning, transition. Burial practices became more elaborate, bodies placed in graves with care, arranged in particular positions, accompanied by objects, tools, ornaments, ochre sprinkled over the deceased, the red powder perhaps symbolizing life, blood, vitality, or simply beautiful, or both, or neither, the symbolic content forever uncertain, but the care itself undeniable. Some burials were especially rich, individuals interred with many objects, suggesting perhaps that social differentiation was increasing, that some people held special status, were recognized as leaders, shamans, skilled craftspeople, or were simply beloved, honored, mourned with particular intensity. Tool technology continued to evolve. Blades became longer, more standardized, struck from carefully prepared cores, creating multiple cutting edges from a single piece of stone. Efficient, elegant, a sophisticated understanding of stone's properties. Backed blades appeared, with one edge deliberately blunted so the tool could be held or hafted safely. Microliths emerged, tiny stone tools that could be set in rows along wooden or bone handles, creating composite tools, saws, arrows, harpoons. The bow and arrow appeared, though exactly when is debated, perhaps 20,000 years ago, perhaps earlier, transforming hunting, allowing kills from greater distances, reducing danger to the hunter, increasing success rates, and requiring new skills. The making of bows with the right tension, arrows that flew straight, tips that penetrated deeply, atlatls, spear throwers, extended the reach and power of thrown spears, a wooden shaft with a hook at one end that held the butt of a spear, lengthening the throwing arm, increasing velocity. Some were carved with elaborate decorations, animals emerging from the wood, functional tools elevated to art, practical and beautiful inseparably merged. Needles appeared in the archaeological record, finely made from bone or ivory, with eyes drilled through for thread, enabling the creation of fitted clothing, essential in the coldest regions, where survival through winter required sophisticated protection from the elements, where poorly made clothing could mean death, and well-made clothing meant comfort, warmth, the ability to hunt and gather even in harsh conditions. The end of the Paleolithic approached slowly, unevenly, arriving at different times in different places, as the great ice sheets began their final retreat. Around 15,000 years ago, the warming began, accelerating around 12,000 years ago, the climate shifting into something warmer, wetter in many regions, more stable. Megafauna began to disappear, the great mammoths, the woolly rhinos, the giant deer going extinct one by one, whether from climate change, from human hunting pressure, from disease, from habitat loss, as forests replaced tundra, probably all of these contributing in different proportions, leaving ecosystems fundamentally altered, impoverished of the giants that had defined them. Humans adapted, as they had always adapted, shifting strategies, focusing on smaller game, increasing reliance on plant foods, fish, shellfish. In the Middle East, around 12,000 years ago, people began to experiment with cultivating plants, wild cereals that could be encouraged, protected, eventually selected for traits that made them easier to harvest, larger seeds, non-shattering heads that didn't drop their grain before collection. The first permanent settlements appeared, people building structures that were meant to last, storing food through seasons, investing in particular places rather than moving constantly. The mobility that had defined the Paleolithic beginning to slow, to root itself, to transform into something different. Around 11,600 years ago, the Younger Dryas, a brief return to colder conditions, challenged these emerging agricultural communities, but they persisted, adapted, and when the cold released its grip and warmth returned, farming spread, villages grew, population increased, and the Paleolithic, that immense span of human time, began to fade into something new. The transition was not sudden, not uniform. Hunter-gatherers persisted in many regions for thousands of years more, some communities combining farming with hunting and gathering, some adopting agriculture and abandoning it when it failed, returning to older patterns. But the overall trajectory was set. The world was warming, changing, and human societies were changing with it. By 10,000 years ago, in some regions, the Paleolithic was effectively over, replaced by the Mesolithic, the Middle Stone Age, characterized by smaller tools, more intensive use of resources, increasing sedentism, and then by the Neolithic, the New Stone Age, with its polished axes, its pottery, its domesticated animals and cultivated crops, its villages becoming towns, becoming cities. But for more than 2 million years before that transformation, for 99% of human existence, the Paleolithic was the human story, mobile groups, stone tools, fire and shelter, the long, slow accumulation of knowledge, the patient adaptation to changing climates and landscapes, the development of art and music and symbolic thought, the caring for the dead, the creation of culture in its earliest forms, and something in us still carries that past, still responds to fire, to stars overhead, to the satisfaction of skilled handwork, to the taste of food cooked over flames, to stories told in darkness, to the bond between people who depend on each other for survival. The Paleolithic is not simply history, not merely the past, but foundation, the deep time that shaped what we are, that made possible everything that came after. I find myself thinking about time again, not as something measured in minutes or hours, but as the Paleolithic people might have experienced it, cyclical rather than linear, marked by the moon's phases, the sun's annual journey, the return of migrating herds, the opening of flowers, the freezing of rivers, the thawing of ice. Each year was not merely a repeat of the previous, not identical, but similar enough that knowledge accumulated, patterns recognized, an unusually cold winter remembered, a year when the berries were particularly abundant. The summer, the great herd took a different route, all held in memory, passed along in stories, becoming the collective wisdom of the group. And within that cyclical time, there was deep time, the sense that things had always been this way, that ancestors stretching back beyond counting had lived these same rhythms, made these same tools, followed these same paths. The weight of tradition must have been enormous, not oppressive necessarily, but grounding, stabilizing, a reassurance that the ways that had worked before would work again. Innovation happened, obviously. The archaeological record proves it, but slowly, gradually, a slight modification to a tool design, adopted, refined, eventually becoming standard, then modified again generations or centuries later, change accumulating in layers so thin that no single lifetime would have noticed much difference. And yet, over millennia, the transformation was profound. What did they think about these people as they sat by fires or walked across grasslands? We cannot know their thoughts, cannot recover their inner lives, but they had the same brains we do, the same capacity for wonder, for curiosity, for imagination. They must have asked questions. Where do the animals go when they migrate? What are the stars? What happens after death? What makes thunder? Why does fire burn? And they must have created answers. Stories that explained, that gave meaning, that connected the visible world to invisible forces. Spirits, perhaps, ancestors watching from beyond, animals with souls and intentions, plants with preferences, a world alive and conscious, populated with beings both seen and unseen, both physical and supernatural. Shamans may have mediated between worlds, individuals with particular gifts, ability to enter trance states, to communicate with spirits, to heal, to divine the future, to call the animals to the hunt. These practices are found in hunter-gatherer societies around the world and may extend deep into the Paleolithic, though the evidence is ambiguous, suggestive, but not definitive. The cave paintings themselves may have been shamanic, created in altered states, in the depths of dark caves where sensory deprivation and flickering light could induce visions, where the boundary between this world and other worlds grew thin, where the animals painted on stone might seem to move, to breathe, to cross over from a spirit into matter and back again. Music and dance may have been technologies of transcendence, ways to alter consciousness, to achieve states where normal reality loosened its grip, where ecstasy became possible, where the group could bond in shared rhythm, shared movement, shared emotion that transcended individual experience. And in all of this, in the practical and the spiritual, in the technological and the artistic, in the daily and the extraordinary, there was something profoundly human, recognizable across all the millennia that separate us. These people were not aliens, not incomprehensible others, but kin, family, the same species capable of the same range of experiences, joy and sorrow, love and loss, curiosity and contentment, fear and courage. They held their children as we hold ours, felt grief when someone died, experienced the pleasure of a meal after hunger, the relief of shelter from storm, the satisfaction of work well done, the comfort of companionship, the ache of loneliness, all the fundamental human experiences that unite us across time, across cultures, across all the superficial differences that might seem to divide. The Paleolithic teaches us about resilience, about adaptability, about the capacity of humans to survive and even thrive in conditions we would consider impossible. They lived through ice ages, through dramatic climate shifts, through ecological upheavals that eliminated entire species, and they persisted, adjusted, innovated just enough to continue, to endure, to pass life forward to the next generation and the next and the next, an unbroken chain of survival extending across hundreds of thousands of years. It teaches us about sufficiency, about living within limits, taking what was needed but not more, because more could not be stored indefinitely, could not be accumulated. Mobility required traveling light, taking only what could be carried. And in that necessity, there was a kind of freedom from the weight of possessions, from the anxiety of protecting wealth, from the complexity of managing excess. It teaches us about community, about interdependence, about the necessity of cooperation for survival. No one could live alone in the Paleolithic. Isolation meant death. The group was essential, and so social bonds were not optional luxuries, but fundamental requirements. And perhaps because of that necessity, those bonds were strong, deep, maintained with care and attention. And it teaches us about slowness, about patience, about the long view. Nothing happened quickly in the Paleolithic. Tool traditions remained stable for millennia. Populations grew at glacial pace. Knowledge accumulated grain by grain, and in that slowness there was perhaps a kind of peace, an absence of the rushing urgency that characterizes our modern lives. Time to observe, to notice, to be present in the moment, because there was nowhere else to be, nothing else demanding attention. The ending of the Paleolithic, the transition to agriculture and settled life, brought tremendous changes: population growth, technological acceleration, the rise of cities and civilizations, writing and mathematics, art and architecture on scales previously impossible. All the achievements we celebrate, all the complexity we inhabit, but it also brought new problems: social stratification, warfare on organized scales, epidemic disease, environmental degradation, the anxieties of surplus and scarcity, the burdens of ownership and inheritance. The Paleolithic had its own hardships, its own dangers and difficulties, but it avoided some of the pathologies that would emerge later. Neither way of life was perfect, neither purely good nor purely bad. Each had its costs and benefits, its joys and sorrows, but the Paleolithic represents something irreplaceable, a way of being human that worked, that sustained our species through almost our entire existence, that shaped our bodies, our minds, our social instincts, our emotional lives in ways we still carry, still express, still feels resonating in moments when we gather around fires, when we work with our hands, when we walk in wild places under open skies. And now that way of life is gone, preserved only in archaeology, in the rare communities of hunter-gatherers that persist in marginal environments, in the deep memories our bodies and brains still hold. The Paleolithic has ended, faded into history, become the foundation upon which everything else was built, the long, slow beginning of the human story, the deep time that made us what we are. I think of the stone again, the one I began with, cool and dense and shaped by careful hands, resting in a palm that knew its weight. And I imagine all the hands that held stones like it, across all those millennia, millions of hands, billions of moments, each one holding the same fundamental reality, the need to survive, the desire to continue, the hope that tomorrow would come and bring with it another chance to live, to love, to endure. The fire burns low now in this imagined scene, the flames reducing to coals, the light dimming, the shadows deepening, and around the last warmth of the hearth, people settle into rest, their day done, their work completed as much as it can be, knowing tomorrow will bring its own tasks, its own challenges, its own small victories. The stars overhead continue their slow wheel, the same stars the Paleolithic people watched, turning through the same patterns, marking time on a scale that makes even the Paleolithic seem brief, and under those stars, in darkness, held back by dying embers, the long story continues, breath by breath, generation by generation, carrying forward into futures unknown and unknowable. The stone rests, waiting, patient, knowing nothing but its own solidity, its own endurance. And in that simple persistence there is something profound, something that needs no words, no explanation, only acknowledgement, only the quiet recognition that it was here, that they were here, that the long, slow story of stone and hand and fire actually happened, actually was, actually laid the foundation for everything that followed, including this moment, this reflection, this gentle fading into silence.